Hello, I'm Mark Burnett, and this is my attempt to complete 40 tracks within a year. I'm just going to get straight into this week's track and give you a quick tour of where it's at. I have done a little bit of tidying up yesterday afternoon. Other than that, the track is exactly how it was whenever it was I left it, which is probably 6-7 years ago now. So here we are. Yeah, so this is the track. It's called Absorption. It's very much in the same kind of barrage, the same kind of concept as the previous track. Another reason why I've decided to go for this track this week, so I can kind of apply some of the same techniques that I applied finishing the mix for the last track. Also some of the things I've learnt. This is where we're at. I'm going to play some sections of it and just talk you through what's going on and then maybe what needs doing. Okay, so without playing you the whole track, that's kind of the intro, just to give you an idea of the tempo and vibe. Just a couple of quick things. So before I started this process, just so FYI, on my master here, I've got this device here that just sends you the high quality audio to the capture so that you're not just listening through the microphone. I always have a limiter on here just in case I accidentally spike the levels. I don't really want to hear nasty distortion, but this shouldn't really be being active. It's just a protection circuit, and I probably actually set it to the default. But what is important is here I've got a utility and the track is monoed, and I've got that set up. I don't know if you can see, maybe you can see if I hop over here. I've got my microphone mute button on off, but I've also got here on my hotkeys basically mono. So I'm going to do all of the work from this point on, getting the arrangement finished and just getting the overall mix right up to pretty much the last few stages of the mix. I'm just going to do it all in mono because it will result in a better mix. Basically, it's as simple as that. At first, it's a bit boring, and then you get used to it, and then you realize that once everything's balanced in mono and you open it out to stereo, it's like, wow, that's amazing. And yeah, rather than the other way around where you've worked it all out in stereo and it sounds amazing in stereo, you fold it to mono and it sounds not very good. So that's one thing that I've done. What's interesting here is there's a processing that I used to do quite often, was to send all the tracks through an other track, so basically busing all the tracks through another track before going to the master, that would enable me to put processing and draw automation and manipulate them automation a little bit more easily and readily than when it's in the master track, and then also keep my master track nice and clear for anything that I needed to do in terms of the kind of final mix or output stage, if you like. And then I also do this thing, or I used to do this thing, where I would send a number of tracks. So if we open this up now, I'd send a number of tracks here via an SC, short for side chain, but it's not really a side chain because what I tend to use is this TAL volume shaper. Well, it's kind of an automated filter. You can set the time coefficient and you can choose filters or conveniently volume. There's loads of envelope tools that do this. This one's free. It's great. I've used it for years. And it gives me really amazing control over the curve of the volume and kind of little to no artifacts. And then once I've got the curve right, I can dial in the amount of that volume curve that I want to apply. And here I've layered two. Interestingly, I'm not going to try and decipher why I did that, but you can imagine that the effect of these two is cumulative, and one is giving a bit more of a gentle pumping effect, and the other one is definitely focusing a little bit more on the immediate transient. So this one's probably doing more to reveal the kick transient, and this one's probably doing more to shape that kind of pumping sound, all of which can be achieved with compression as well. I just find this visual method a little bit easier to suss out. So that's one thing that's happening. There's obviously some imbalances in the mix right from the off, and I'm immediately noticing, especially another thing in mono, you really kind of notice how much space you've put onto things like reverb and stuff. And I will need to sort of have a look into what exactly I've done with the reverbs in this track. We've got 2 different reverbs, though they seem to be identical. That's interesting. Very interesting. They are basically identical. They're on equal outputs. They've got the same algorithms. Well, that's fun. It's always great trying to work out what the hell I did 7 years ago. Must have been a reason for it. And then I've got various levels of automation going on, some of which may be a bit of a pain in the bum, depending on what they are. I'm just going to have to go through all of that stuff and kind of tidy it up, make sure it's good. So the next stage in the process for me would be just to have a quick listen through some more sections. This epic track here, or group, is going to be the place where I need to do the most work. I did already do a bit of tidying up with this yesterday. It gets a bit, it gets a bit meandery, really. It's kind of all about this sitar, this kind of rich, granular sitar sound, which is also present in the last track. Which I obviously liked. I think this was about the same time that I did this track. I obviously was loving this sound and played with it a lot. And you can kind of tell that this little jam here that's going on throughout, this lead, is very much me just getting a bit lost with the melodic construction. And I did take out yesterday quite a large section here where it just kind of goes really a little bit, left of center. So, so I'm going to have to do some work on these. I'll just play a bit of this for you now. Yeah, so there's a lot going on here. I've kind of almost basically layered the same sound just on different octaves. And I think it's kind of texturally, it's really interesting. It's really full, but it might just be a bit much. I have already stripped it down a bit yesterday, some of the sections where it was getting a bit OTT. But particularly this section, I'm going to have to work on a bit. Yeah, so that kind of, it doesn't really go anywhere. It was sort of part of a longer womble that I put in the middle here. I just want to simplify the track down a bit. I mean, it was closer to 8 minutes. The last track was ridiculously long, but a track is a track, doesn't really matter. And again, without going too far away from what the original idea was, I just kind of want to simplify this section. Probably will result in deleting quite a bit of it. So the next stage for me, given that I'm relatively happy, there's one thing that I'm going to have a look in more detail at, and that's these two builds here. I spent a little bit of time yesterday trying to work out what to do, and I added an extra layer using some automation, I believe, here. So what's going on in this track here is quite a lot to sort of absorb. but Absorption is the name of the track. Here we go. So this is. It also gets difficult when you've got a pitch in here because it scrolls. Okay, so let me get rid of stuff that's not actually automated. Try and simplify this a little. Okay, so to make this build here, get rid of that as well. Let's make this a bit smaller. And this is quite typical with builds, is you find that you need to put a lot of automation together to make interesting stuff. Now there's two parts here that are working together. There's one that's a fairly generic, or was rather a fairly generic noise build. Okay, and that was built using, again, reusing a lot of samples from the track, which is what I tend to do. This was resampled from the hi-hats, I believe. This was resampled from one of the other grain leads. Here's the kick that I used, or the snare even. Again, just thrown into a sampler so that it's looping. It's got textures and tones from within the track, so that it kind of sounds... It's not just a copy and paste riser from a random pack. It has some kind of sonic congruence that works with the track. There's a track in there that's not being used, so I'll delete that. And then there's Novation. There's operator in here as well with a noise modulated, FM modulated, but well, it's not actually because they're all in parallel. So it's noise wave and a sort of triangle or a saw wave layered there in this top. Sort of hear that kind of noise. That's giving it the sort of noise. That's giving it a bit of the tonal content of the part itself, you know, the grain lead. Same goes there. And that's just giving it, again, like another bit of sort of texture and transient from within the track. What's going on after that is a whole bunch of stuff, mostly distortion related. So I think the interesting thing here, though, is what's happening, again, with the automation. So here I've just got AutoPan being used as a chopper. So this is quite a common technique. Just by setting the phase to 0, you can use the AutoPan to create a kind of stutter effect. And what's happening is the amount of that is simply rising here towards the end. What's important when you use this, though, which a lot of people don't get, is you really have to play with the offset. So like how this is exactly offset against the position of the beats. So the timing offset, basically, because it makes a massive difference. And it doesn't necessarily have to be perfectly aligned on the beat. It has to just sound like it's got the right alignment for that particular pattern, and that can mean that could be almost anywhere. It's like this whole thing with syncopation and polyrhythms. The offsetting of certain rhythmical patterns is quite often beneficial. So that's just an important point when using that. What else is happening here is the noise hit attack filter frequency, whatever the hell that is. Oh, that's probably something in here. Yeah, so I'm modulating the frequency of the filter in there. That's pretty straightforward. And then decimort, which is somewhere in here, I think in this chain. Yeah, so the decimort here is then, I've got one of the parameters in here. Yeah, the frequency of the decimator section here is being sweeped, and that's giving it this kind of notchy sweep effect that's going on. So that's what's happening with white noise thing here. And then I felt that was kind of good. Not actually using the amp and the EQ8 here. For some reason, not quite sure. I think it might be used later on. And then in this section here, what I did was, I do this a lot. Again, I'm using what used to be the freeze function in the delay, is now this infinite feedback function, which is a little bit tricky to get your head around, because the delay has to be on for it to work, and then you have to activate the infinite feedback function after the delay has been activated in order to capture any sound. But that's why you can see there's this bit of a stagger here. So I'm turning the delay device on first of all, and then just afterwards I'm turning on the delay freeze. And that's catching a small loop of audio in here basically, which is then undergoing some similar transformations. The dry wet here is kind of my main control over how much of that loop's coming through. And then I've also got here this amp dry wet, which is really, and again, the amp is only coming on. We put these together. So the amp is coming on later on before the dry wet is activated, just to make sure that the amp is only on for this section, because I don't want that amp on for the whole rest of this track. Anyway, it sounds a bit like this. Which I think works quite well in context with the rest of the build. I mean, there's a bit of work to be done on levels there, but that'll all be resolved in the mix. So what I need to do, though, is, or where I gave up yesterday, was sort of trying to replicate something like that in this section here, where the second drop should be, because I cut out a load of stuff, and I think I just cut out too much, so I might have to revert to a slightly earlier version and then redo this edit here. But that's basically what I'm going to do now. And then once I've done that, I'm going to print all of these tracks to audio and then have a look at going through the mix. Yeah, so again, this is week 2 of my production. It's week 3 of 2020, but it's coming on well. I really appreciate all the comments and support I've had so far. If you like what you see and what you hear, click on the like button, click on the subscribe button. Apparently you have to say that because people forget. I'm generally not trying to push this. I just want you to remember to do the things that you would do if you didn't get distracted. And of course, I really appreciate anyone who invests a little bit of money in my music. That helps support this project and will help support me in my pursuits as an artist moving forwards. Okay, so I'm about halfway through all the faffing around to do with this track now, and I'm not quite printed it all to audio yet because I needed to tidy up envelopes and general sound design stuff and arrangement. So I'll just kind of show you where I've got to at this stage. So, yeah, obviously deleted any tracks that weren't necessary. I've gone through. One of the things that I do quite a lot when I'm doing kind of final arrangement, if I've got the arrangement pretty much sussed and I want to make like several changes to the arrangement, but I'm not entirely sure how that's going to pan out. And you know what happens when you do that is quite often you end up adjusting tiny envelopes and effects changes and little ends and tails of clips and fade-ins and stuff. And then, of course, if you want to then step back to a previous arrangement, you've then got to redo all of that detail, which can be a bit frustrating. So one of the things I do before I start sort of cut and shut the arrangement is to select the entire arrangement as it stands and then just hit Command-Shift-D. And that will duplicate everything that's there. As you can see, I've already done that. And that keeps a copy of the original arrangement with all the automation exactly right next to the one that I'm about to edit down. So if for some reason I delete a section and then I do a load of work on it and then I change my mind, I realise that it didn't quite work out how I wanted, I can cut and paste the section back into the arrangement, and using the clever use of the automation lock button here enables you to then repaste these sections over existing envelopes that you've done here. So this is actually a really incredibly useful tool and a really useful process when it comes to doing finicky stuff like working out exactly how you're gonna break various sections down, and you want to try 2 or 3 different ways, but you don't want to end up with a huge mess of an undo history. So anyway, I've got that far, which means I can now comfortably delete all of that. And I use the cut function to delete because then it deletes the time. Command Shift X rather, so I'm cutting time. That makes sure that there's no outlying envelopes or weird automation things that are still somewhere out in the field here. Another good thing to do at this stage is then to select all to see if there's any random stuff you've left out here, because if there's even one data point all the way out here, for example, if I then select all, it will select up to where that last data point is, which might not be easily visible. So anyway, that's why cut time is a great tool. Gets rid of all that. And before I go printing these stems now to audio, I'm pretty happy with how I've managed to pull this kind of, in terms of shape of the arrangement, a bit better together. But what I've spent the majority of the time doing is working on these envelopes and getting them as close to however I need them as possible. There's another little error there, something that slipped through the net. And then I finally just wanted to show you before I print this, although the master effect stuff will stay on. Of course, here I've got my master chain. I've used here a technique that I use quite a lot when I'm doing sort of score sound design and stuff, where you want these really massive impact, dynamic impacts. It's quite tricky to get these right. You really do have to faff around quite a bit. And what's happening here is simply that on the master track itself, as we approach this drop here, we're getting the sound filtered out. And then at the very last moment, there's a tiny little mute. So we're actually got on the master channel complete silence for a very short period of time. And of course, as you know, the dynamic range is the difference between the quietest part of the track and the loudest part of the track in any particular given region. And so that really helps to boost the dynamic of this drop. I'll just play it back to you. So what you have to pay attention to when you do this is the detail. So when I zoom right in here, you'll see that I've taken the edges off this this envelope here, and I've added the filter envelope basically over the top of this area to mask this mute being switched on and off, because sometimes you get kind of clicks and stuff from the mute being activated and deactivated. And I also don't have it coming back on exactly on the drop. I've left it a little bit of time before, just again to help to prevent any kind of clicking that might occur when you've got so many parts being muted and unmuted instantaneously. Yeah, and this again, you just have to kind of be careful with all the settings, and it takes a bit of time to get these curves right, so that it doesn't sound too much like a filter sweep. And turning the resonance down on the filter a lot can really help to do that. Helps it sound a bit more like a natural sort of volume curve. And you can do the same thing just with the master volume. But one more thing that I do like to do, and do quite often, is to automate the actual track arm buttons, because that's another way to do this on a per track basis, just to kind of mute an entire track, bring it back in. I'll quite often do that before drops. And I'll also do it just after drops with things like return tracks, because when you've hit a big drop and there's a lot of reverb or delay, sometimes it's nice to have a really clean transition. And when you want to do that, I tend to use the track activators here and basically mute those for a short period of time after the drop. So here we are, the final mix, and I'm just rendering it out now. So it was quite a straightforward process in the end, because I'd already done such a lot of work in the initial sort of composition and design stages on getting the sounds to fit in a particular space. There's obviously a lot of harmonic and reverb and stuff, and I've kind of culled quite a bit of that in order to provide a bit more definition to the mix. I've obviously also here dragged in a reference track, which is crudely appropriate. It's at least reasonably well delivered itself, mainly to get a focus on the low end and getting a kind of a sensible reference point for the low end, because that tends to be one of the trickiest areas. and overall just the mix. And then, of course, continually referencing in mono throughout the process, just to make sure that it all translates really well. And then at the final stage, obviously making sure that I haven't, that I'm not running into the limiter on the master at all, that I've got some headroom, and that I've obviously deactivated the mono feature, so I'm not printing my pre-master in mono. And that's pretty much it. There was a little bit of messing around to do with regards to getting these tracks back in, because I had to basically render them out and then copy them back in and duplicate some of the devices, because one of the things I'm doing here with the kick and bass, in order to make a bit more room, which many EQ plugins do this sort of dynamic EQ. Let me turn this down a little bit. Actually activate this, otherwise you won't hear it. But you'll see what's going on. Basically, I've got an envelope follower on the kick that's picking up the signal for the kick. You can see here. And then that is in turn then activating a band on the EQ8 of the bass when it's on. And you can see it's only a small amount that I'm making that happen, but it's just, again, making a little bit of room around where the weight of the kick is. I sort of experimented a little bit with how much that needed to happen. It didn't need a lot because I already have this volume envelope that's ducking a lot of the kick out of the way at that point. But there were some sections where they were kind of playing together, and I just felt that removing a little bit sort of dynamic EQ there made quite a nice difference. Yeah, so on the whole, pretty much finished. I did a small bit of rearrangement, but that's this week's track done. Great. And when I go into my folder here, hopefully, we will see tracks to finish, pre-masters. Here it is. I'm going to obviously proof it through one more time. Top tip, always proof listen all the way through, right to the very end of the very last bit of the tail of your track before you send it off for mastering, because it can cost you money and time if you've got a truncated end or something near the end of the track isn't quite right, which is the part of the track that you're most likely to miss, because what we tend to do is load the track up, play the first few seconds, go, yeah, that sounds okay, and then send it off. So always proof listen to your tracks, which is what I'm going to do now. And thanks very much for joining me again in production week 2. And we'll see next week. I think I'm going to tackle something a little bit more difficult, as in a little bit less developed, or perhaps something that's a completely different lilt to these rather full-on cinematic techno tracks that I've been doing. Yeah, again, thanks for following me. And if you like what you see, click on the like button. If you want to hear more, check out the links below. There's loads of links there to the various other stuff that I do. Yeah, check it out, and thanks for your support. Ciao.